Welcome to the realm of science fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Enjoy listening. Tinks had spent years training as a warrior across the galaxy, but now it was time to return to her colony. However, before she could even set foot on home soil, she received devastating news. Her colony was under attack. The enemy had launched a brutal assault, and by the time she arrived, it might already be too late. Sitting in the dimly lit military transport, she remained silent, lost in thought. Directly entering the colony would be suicidal. The enemy's forces were too well-organized. Patrolling drones dominated the sky, while mechanized troops controlled the ground. If she were to survive, she needed a plan. Beside her sat a battle-hardened soldier, his face partially revealed as he pushed back his helmet slightly. His sharp eyes turned to her as she finally spoke. "How do we get in?" Tinks asked, her mind racing through possibilities. The soldier adjusted the heavy rifle slung across his back and checked the weapons on his belt. "First, let's see what we have," he said grimly. "Standard assault rifle, plasma pistol, and shock grenades. We could take out a small patrol quietly, but the moment we step inside, they'll know we're there." Tinks nodded. It wasn't enough. Stealth might be an option, but the enemy's preparation was unknown. The soldier hesitated before adding, "I can call in a few people. Men I trust. With more bodies, we'll have more flexibility." Tinks inhaled deeply. She couldn't reclaim her home alone. She needed an army. With a nod, she signaled him to make the call. Within minutes, 3 shadowy figures emerged from the darkness, allies prepared to fight for their cause. Together, they huddled over a holographic map, analyzing possible entry points. The eastern sector of the colony contained abandoned service tunnels, perhaps their best chance to infiltrate without immediate detection. The problem? No one knew how heavily those tunnels were guarded. Time was short. They had to act now. Silently, they made their way toward the tunnel entrance, only to find 2 enemy soldiers patrolling nearby. The soldier beside Tinks pulled out his plasma pistol, switching it to silent mode. 2 quick shots. The sentries collapsed. The team dragged the bodies into the shadows before slipping inside. As they ventured deeper, the echoes of battle grew louder from within the colony. Soon, they reached a large maintenance bay where a group of enemy troops was stockpiling ammunition. Tinks gave the signal. The ambush was swift. Gunfire erupted. The soldiers' rifle shredded through the enemy ranks, while Tinks moved like a specter, her plasma blade cutting through foes before they could react. Shock grenades exploded, disorienting the remaining soldiers. Within moments, the area was secure. Tinks scanned her team, no casualties. One of the men retrieved a fallen soldier's communicator. He listened for a moment before his face darkened. Reinforcements were on their way, heavily armed and armored. They couldn't stay. The team retreated to an abandoned shelter, an old bunker from a past war. Inside, they found scattered weapons and partially functioning generators. Tinks exhaled sharply as she examined the map once more. The battle wasn't just about survival anymore. If they stayed on this path, the colony would be lost. She needed a different approach. Grabbing an enemy radio, she transmitted a direct message to their forces. "Whoever is listening, deliver this message to your commander. I want to meet him alone and unarmed." A tense silence followed before a cold voice replied, "Request approved." Tinks turned to her team. They protested, but she stood firm. There was no other way. She stepped into the meeting site alone. A massive, armored vehicle approached from a distance, stopping just a few feet away. From it emerged a tall man with piercing eyes, his uniform immaculate. Authority radiated from him. He was a man used to giving orders. He studied her with suspicion as she walked forward, deliberately slowing her pace, moving with grace and confidence. His sharp gaze followed her every movement. "So," he said, his voice edged with authority, "you came unarmed. If this isn't a trap, what do you want?" Tinks tilted her head slightly, a faint smile forming on her lips. "Oh, Commander, must you be so direct? I expected a little warmth." Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it struck like lightning. Something flickered in his expression, an unguarded moment, quickly suppressed. Tinks played her part flawlessly. She lifted a hand, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, ensuring he noticed the delicate motion. "This war will have no victor," she continued, her tone soft but unwavering. "But perhaps there is a way for both sides to win." His eyes narrowed. She could see the tension in his jaw. Silence worked in her favor. Taking a step closer, she let her gaze drop briefly to his lips before returning to his eyes. "I believe we should discuss this in private." A flicker of hesitation crossed his face. Tinks saw it the moment he wavered. A delicate touch on his wrist. A slow, deliberate slide upward. His muscles tense beneath her fingertips. The battle inside him was clear. And then it happened. His hand moved to her waist, his other brushing along her chin, lifting her face toward his. Their lips met. At first, it was cautious. Then, deeper. The battlefield faded, leaving only the heat between them. As they pulled away, Tinks took his hand, stepping back with an inviting glance. "Let's go." He followed. The stunned soldiers didn't question it. Back at the hideout, the dim lighting cast shadows across the walls. The commander's expression remained unreadable, but Tinks saw it. The spark, the curiosity, the desire. "Now," she whispered, "we can truly talk." Before he could reply, she leaned in, fingers grazing the collar of his uniform. She guided him closer, and he led her. That night, words became unnecessary. By morning, the battlefield outside had changed. A ceasefire had been declared. Inside, however, a new war had just begun. Tinks stirred before dawn, quietly dressing. Her fingers brushed the small knife on her belt as she approached his desk, scanning the data tablet left there. And then she smiled. He wasn't just a commander. He was the true leader of the enemy forces. The moment he awoke, she was standing before him. "What are you doing?" His voice was still laced with sleep, but his guard was already rising. Tinks reached out, gently tilting his chin. "We're making a deal, my dear commander." His eyes darkened. "What kind of deal?" She leaned in, whispering into his ear. "You're going to marry me." Shock rippled across his face before he forced a laugh. "You must be joking." Tinks's smile never wavered. "Oh, I assure you I'm not." His expression hardened. "I know who you are. I know what you've done. Your men trust you. But if they found out the truth about you, how long do you think you'd last?" His jaw clenched. She continued, her voice velvet and steel. "Either you marry me and end this war, or I expose everything." The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. The commander's jaw clenched, his sharp gaze locked onto Tinks's unwavering eyes. He had spent years mastering the art of war, of control, of bending others to his will. And yet, in this moment, it was he who was being cornered by a woman who played the game better than he had anticipated. He exhaled sharply, stepping closer. "You're ambitious," he murmured, his voice laced with something between admiration and frustration. "But you're also reckless. What makes you think I won't kill you right here?" Tinks smiled, slow and knowing. "Because if you were going to kill me, you would have done it already." She lifted the stolen data tablet slightly, her fingers trailing along its edge. "I have contingencies in place. If I die, my people will release every bit of incriminating evidence about you. Your soldiers may follow you out of fear or loyalty, but if they learn the truth, they will rip you apart." A muscle twitched in his jaw. She could see the war waging inside him. She took a step closer, their bodies almost touching. "You don't have another choice," she whispered. "You think I'm reckless, but I think you're afraid. Afraid to lose, afraid to be controlled." Her eyes darkened. "But what if I told you that together, we wouldn't just end this war? We could own everything." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, something shifted in the commander's expression. He wasn't a fool. He knew the power of alliances, of strategy, of influence. And here stood a woman who had already infiltrated his walls, not with brute force, but with cunning. "You play a dangerous game," he said finally. Tinks tilted her head. "I always win." A slow, mirthless chuckle escaped him. Very well, he said, his voice laced with reluctant amusement. You'll have your marriage. The news of their sudden alliance sent shockwaves through both factions. The battle-hardened soldiers of Tinks's colony were furious, while the commander's loyalists were wary. Whispers spread like wildfire. Some believed it was a political move to seize control, others suspected blackmail, and a few dared to suggest that the ruthless commander had finally met his match. The ceremony was swift, efficient, devoid of romance. Tinks stood tall, draped in a sleek, silver-stitch garment that clung to her form like armor. The commander was rigid beside her, his face unreadable, though his sharp eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite name. When the vows were exchanged, she leaned in just enough for only him to hear. "This is not the end, dear husband," she whispered, her lips barely brushing his ear. "This is just the beginning of a new war." The commander didn't flinch. His expression remained carved from stone, but the glint in his eyes, sharp, knowing, betrayed his amusement. He had spent years maneuvering through war zones, navigating betrayals and blood-soaked battlefields. And now, here he was, standing at the altar, staring into the eyes of the most dangerous opponent he had ever faced. His wife. Tinks pulled away with a smirk, her fingers still gripping his as the ceremony concluded. Their hands remained bound in the ceremonial clasp, the symbol of unity between two factions that had once sworn to destroy each other. Applause echoed through the grand hall, though it was forced, hesitant. Soldiers and dignitaries from both sides watched with a mixture of suspicion and unease. Some whispered among themselves, others exchanged wary glances. No one truly believed in the so-called peace, least of all the bride and groom. The reception was an elaborate diplomatic spectacle. Silver goblets clinked, plates were filled with delicacies from both nations, and tension crackled in the air like a brewing storm. Tinks sat beside her new husband at the grand table, their thrones placed side by side. The commander leaned in, his breath warm against her skin. "Enjoying yourself, wife?" She took a slow sip of her wine, her eyes flicking over the room, reading every nervous glance, every false smile. "More than I thought I would," she murmured. "It's entertaining, watching them wonder who will betray the other first." He chuckled under his breath. "Let them wonder." A messenger approached, bowing before them. "A moment of your time, my lord. Urgent matters regarding the eastern borders." The commander rose, excusing himself, but as he did, his hand brushed against Tinks's, deliberate, possessive. A silent message. She watched him go, her gaze unreadable. He was playing the game well, but so was she. Late that night, in the chambers they now shared, the tension between them coiled tighter. The room was dimly lit by the flickering glow of candlelight. The commander stood near the window, his hands clasped behind his back, looking out over the city that was now, in theory, theirs to rule together. Tinks leaned against the doorframe, watching him. "You didn't hesitate today." He turned his head slightly. "Neither did you." She took a slow step forward. "It's almost disappointing." His brow arched. "Disappointing." She circled him like a predator. "I expected you to resist more, to try and undermine me. But instead, you played along so easily. Makes me wonder." She stopped just behind him, her voice a whisper against his shoulder. "Are you truly submitting to this alliance? Or are you simply waiting for the perfect moment to strike?" He turned then, slow and deliberate, his dark eyes meeting hers. "The same question could be asked of you." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken threats and promises. Finally, he smirked. "But I have to admit, you do make a compelling queen." Tinks tilted her head, considering him. Then, with a slow smile, she reached up and unfastened the dagger strapped to her thigh. She placed it on the table between them, a challenge, a warning. "The war may be over," she murmured, "but between us, it has only just begun." The commander's smirk widened ever so slightly. "I would expect nothing less."